So you get this present. You're so excited, ripping off the paper. You get it opened up. What's inside? A clock. Oh, this isn't just any clock. This is a vintage 1953 Mickey Mouse rotary made of custom formed vinyl, limited edition. Oh, that is one sweet puppy. This is the clock you've always dreamed of. Look at that beauty. What's the first thing you do? You want to set your clock, right? You run into the living room, look at the clock on the wall, and set your Mickey Mouse to the clock on the wall. And then it hits you, wait, is that clock on the wall right? And you remember, oh, yeah, it's okay. My dad set the clock on the wall using his wristwatch. Well, wait, what did your dad use to set his wristwatch? So then you ask him. And he says, oh, that's easy. I just looked at the clock tower downtown. Now think about it for a minute. If every clock is set by looking at another clock, then how did the very first clock get set when there was no clock to look at? What was the very first clock? Think about that. In this lesson, we're going to consider how the very first clock was set. So first, let's take a step back and ask ourselves an important question. Why do we even use clocks at all? A day often works just fine for keeping track of time. Think of the things we say, like, bye, see you in 3 days. Or in a conversation, oh yeah, I just saw him yesterday. If day were all we had for keeping track of time, that would actually be pretty lousy. I mean, can you imagine this bride, for example? She scheduled the wedding for Tuesday. She was there. She waited hours. And the groom didn't show. But in his defense, he says, I was there on Tuesday. I showed up. Yeah, Tuesday night. By then, the bride had given up. See, when all we were doing was living in caves a long time ago, hunting for food all day, the concept of day was probably good enough. We didn't need anything more detailed than that. But at some point, human beings started to live in civilizations, and they started to form cities where lots of people live close to one another. And so people began to schedule things, town meetings, celebrations like weddings, times to meet and trade things. Now, all of this continues on into today, and even more so than ever. Can you imagine? You go to the airport to greet someone, and you don't know what time their flight comes in, or you have to just stay there all day? Modern civilized life requires that we be more detailed about time, and the concept of just day by itself isn't good enough anymore. So at some point, someone realized we have to split the day into smaller parts. We could have split it into any number of smaller parts. Just like if you have a pizza, you can cut a pizza into as many pieces as you want. 8 pieces, 12 pieces, 6 pieces. You choose, it could be any number. The same thing is true for a day. You could divide it into any number of pieces. How about 24? We've been dividing the day up into 24 parts for thousands of years now. It was the ancient Egyptians and some other ancient civilizations who decided on the number 24. Why 24? Is there something special about that number? The short answer is, not really. Just like cutting up a pizza, it could have been any number of pieces. But there is some reason that the ancient civilizations chose 24. I'll tell you. First of all, it wasn't actually 24 that was important to them, but the number 12. You see, the ancient Egyptians divided the day into 2 parts, daytime and nighttime. So far, we've only used a sky dome for daytime, when the sun rises, reaches noon, and then sets. But since we know the next day the sun comes back and rises in the east, we can imagine the sun's path continuing below the ground and coming around this way. It doesn't actually go below the ground, of course. It's that the earth is spinning, and so the sun is being seen on the other side of the earth. But it's helpful to visualize its path as being down here during the nighttime. So the ancient Egyptians had these 2 halves, daytime and nighttime, and they divided each half into 12 parts. So they had 12 parts of daytime and 12 parts of nighttime. 12 plus 12 equals 24. That's where you get the idea of 24 hours in a day. But why 12? What's so special about that number? Why did they choose to divide each half into 12 parts? Well, when we are counting things, we often count using our fingers. Because we have 10 fingers, we've given a special importance to the number 10. We like to count years by tens. We call them decades. You ever hear people talk about the 70s or the 80s or the 90s? We like to make top 10 lists. In fact, our whole number system is based on the number 10. Notice how we have 10 different symbols that we use for numbers? But this is just a custom we have. Just because you have 10 fingers doesn't mean it's the only way to count things. Different people have used different customs. For example, the ancient Egyptians, whenever they'd count, they'd use their thumb to count their finger segments rather than count each finger itself. Go ahead and count your finger segments using your thumb. How many finger segments do you have? From now on, you can think of the sun as like a giant hour hand moving across an invisible clock in the sky. When the sun is directly overhead, this is noon. Then it gets to 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m., until sunset at 6 p.m. But look at this photo taken sometime in the afternoon. School's gonna let out. Is the sun at 2 o'clock here? 3 o'clock? 4 o'clock? Without those imaginary numbers painted up there, it's hard to tell just by looking at the sky. Not to mention, you shouldn't actually look at the sun. It's dangerous. If only there were some way to easily measure the sun's position. Well, there is. Here's a hint. Watch this video that's been sped up and notice what happens. Do you see what's going on with the shadows? Okay, stop and discuss. So we see that shadows move across the ground during the day as the sun moves across the sky. We can't write numbers of each hour on the sky to keep track of time, but using the shadows, we could write numbers of each hour on the ground, right? So when the shadow's here, we could make a mark. And then as that shadow moves, we could make more marks on the ground. This is how the very first clocks were made. We just kept track of the sun's shadow on the ground. This type of clock is called a sundial. Now obviously, clocks today are a bit more complicated in how they work, but they're telling you the exact same thing. The hour hand on a clock is telling you the sun's position in the sky, just like a shadow on the ground.